On the morning of November 15, 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman stood at the edge of Atlanta and watched it burn. Not the whole city. He had ordered his engineers to spare the homes, the churches, the hospitals, but the rail yards, the foundries, the machine shops, the warehouses stuffed with Confederate military supplies, all of it going up in sheets of orange fire, black smoke coiling into a Georgia sky that had barely finished warming from a long southern autumn. Sherman watched it for a while, then he turned his back on it and started walking. He had 60,000 men behind him and not a single telegraph wire connecting him to Washington. No supply line, no reinforcements coming, no orders beyond the ones he'd written himself. He stepped off the edge of the known military map and into something that had no real precedent in the history of American warfare. And he moved so fast that by the time the Confederacy figured out what he was actually doing, it was already over. People talk about Sherman's march to the sea like it was a slow grind of devastation, a months-long punishment march through a helpless civilian landscape. That framing misses what made it militarily extraordinary and psychologically catastrophic for the South. The thing that broke the Confederate interior wasn't just the destruction, it was the speed. It was the sheer disorienting velocity of 60,000 Union soldiers moving through the heart of Georgia at a pace the Confederate government could not track, could not intercept, could not respond to in any meaningful way. Sherman covered roughly 300 miles in 32 days. That works out to nearly 10 miles a day, every day, through hostile terrain in winter with an army that was foraging entirely off the land it was destroying. No army that size had moved that fast through that kind of country in this war. The Confederates had built their entire defensive theory around the idea that a Union army in the Deep South would be strangled by its supply lines. Sherman just cut his supply lines before they could be cut for him, and then he ran. If you want more history that actually changes how you see the world, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an upload. What made the speed possible was a decision Sherman had been turning over in his mind long before Atlanta fell. The conventional military wisdom of the era held that an army was only as strong as its logistics tail. The wagon trains, the supply depots, the railroad infrastructure feeding ammunition and food forward to the fighting men. Every general in the war understood this. Sherman understood it too, and he concluded it was both true and strategically irrelevant if you simply stopped needing a logistics tail. He spent the weeks before the march stripping his army down to essentials. He sent away every man who was sick, every soldier whose enlistment was running short, every officer he considered dead weight. He reduced his artillery to 65 guns, a fraction of what a Union force that size would normally carry. He cut his wagon train to the minimum needed to haul ammunition and medical supplies. Everything else his army needed, it would take from Georgia.
The foraging system Sherman put in place was organized in a way that most accounts underplay. It wasn't looting. It wasn't an army of 60,000 men wandering off into the countryside and helping themselves to whatever they found. Sherman divided his force into 4 corps, moving on parallel roads, typically spread across a front 20 to 60 miles wide. Each morning, designated foraging parties, usually a few dozen men per regiment, chosen for their reliability and physical conditioning, would push out ahead of the main column before dawn. They fanned across the Georgia landscape with wagons, moving into farms, plantations, and homesteads that the main army wouldn't reach until hours later. By the time the bulk of Sherman's force came down the road, the foragers had already stripped the corn cribs and smokehouse, loaded sweet potatoes and slaughtered hogs and sacked grain into their wagons, and rejoined the column. The army ate that night. It would do the same thing tomorrow, in a different county, on a different road. This system, relentless, methodical, almost industrial in its efficiency, is what allowed Sherman to sustain 60,000 men in the field with essentially no external supply. And because the foraging parties moved fast and ranged wide, the destruction wasn't concentrated in a single corridor. It was everywhere. It was total. The Confederate response to Sherman's departure from Atlanta was, at its core, a catastrophe of intelligence. Jefferson Davis and his generals in Richmond knew Sherman had left. They knew he was moving southeast. What they did not know, what they genuinely could not determine for days, then weeks, was where he was going. Savannah seemed the most logical target. Augusta, with its Confederate powder works, was another possibility. Macon, with its armories, was a third. Sherman had structured his march specifically to maintain that ambiguity, keeping his columns aimed at multiple potential targets simultaneously and committing to none of them until the last possible moment. Confederate General William Hardee, tasked with defending Savannah, spent most of November trying to guess which direction Sherman would ultimately turn. He was still guessing when Sherman's lead elements were 30 miles from the city. The Confederate cavalry force assigned to shadow Sherman's march and slow him down was under the command of Major General Joseph Wheeler, a capable officer working with a fundamentally impossible task. Wheeler had roughly 8,000 horsemen. Sherman had 60,000 infantry. Wheeler could harass the flanks of the Union columns, skirmish with the foragers, burn bridges ahead of Sherman's engineers, and he did all of these things, repeatedly, without meaningful effect. Sherman's engineers rebuilt bridges faster than Wheeler could burn them. In one instance, near the Oconee River, Union pontoon crews had a crossing functional in under 3 hours after Wheeler's men had destroyed the structure the previous evening. The pace of Sherman's march simply swallowed Wheeler's interference. Every day, Sherman moved 10 miles. Every day, the window for any serious Confederate response got smaller.
The Georgia militia, the last organized Confederate force available to contest the march through the state's interior, was a collection of old men and boys that the Confederate conscription system had already squeezed 3 times. They had muskets but limited ammunition. They had officers but no real training as a cohesive fighting force. When they attempted to slow Sherman's advance at the small town of Griswoldville on November 22nd, the result was a slaughter so one-sided it left Union veterans disturbed rather than triumphant. The militia, including men well into their 50s and boys who had not yet grown into their uniforms, advanced across an open field against a Union brigade that was well-positioned, well-armed, and fighting behind earthworks. The Confederates were repulsed 3 times. They left over 600 dead and wounded on the field. The Union brigade suffered fewer than 100 casualties. After the fight, Union soldiers walked out among the Confederate dead and found themselves looking at men their fathers' ages and boys their younger brothers' ages. One Wisconsin soldier wrote in his diary that night that it was the worst thing he had seen in 3 years of war. Not the violence itself, but the evidence of what the Confederacy had been reduced to fielding. Georgia had nothing left to put in front of Sherman's army that could actually stop it. The destruction of the railroad infrastructure was the piece of Sherman's march that the Confederate High Command understood best and dreaded most, because they understood exactly what it would cost them. Georgia's railroad network was the connective tissue of Confederate logistics in the Western Theater. The lines running through Macon and Augusta and Savannah were the routes by which food, ammunition, and reinforcements moved between Confederate armies. Sherman understood this too, which is why he did not simply bypass the railroads, he annihilated them. Every mile of track his army crossed, he destroyed. The rails were heated over burning crossties until they were soft enough to wrap around trees or telegraph poles, a technique soldiers called Sherman's neckties. It wasn't enough to bend the rails. Bent rails could be straightened and relaid. Sherman's men heated them past the point of recovery, twisting them into shapes no Confederate repair crew could undo without manufacturing entirely new iron. An army moving 10 miles a day could wreck 10 miles of railroad a day. In 60,000 men wrecking 10 miles of track means the destruction happened in hours. The Atlanta and Macon line, the central of Georgia, the Savannah and Gulf, miles and miles of them, reduced to twisted iron sculptures in smoldering wood. Months of Confederate repair work, decades of antebellum investment, gone in the time it takes to march from breakfast to supper.
There is a number that does not get quoted often enough when people discuss what Sherman took from Georgia in those 32 days. His own chief of commissary, Colonel Amos Beckwith, estimated after the march that the army had consumed or destroyed approximately $100 million worth of Confederate property. That figure, in 1864 dollars, represents a staggering fraction of the Confederacy's remaining material capacity. It includes the livestock, roughly 10,000 horses and mules seized from Georgia farms, the draft animals upon which Southern agriculture ran. It includes the foodstuffs, millions of pounds of corn, bacon, sweet potatoes, sorghum, peanuts, fodder. It includes the cotton ginning equipment and the blacksmith shops and the small manufacturing concerns that the Confederate war economy depended on to keep itself functioning at the county and township level. Sherman was not merely feeding his army, he was systematically dismantling the economic infrastructure that allowed Georgia to function as a Confederate state. He moved so fast that virtually none of it could be hidden, moved, or defended before he arrived.
The psychological dimension of the march, what it did to Confederate morale on the home front and in the army, has been analyzed at length by historians, but it is still difficult to fully convey. The letters that Georgia civilians wrote during November and December of 1864 have a quality that is distinct from the anxious, defiant correspondence of earlier war years. There is something quieter in them, something that reads less like fear and more like the exhaustion that comes after fear has run its course and left nothing behind it. A woman named Dolly Lunt Burge, whose plantation lay directly in the path of one of Sherman's columns, recorded in her diary the day the army came through. She described it simply. "They came like a swarm," she wrote, "and then they were gone, and everything was different. The smokehouse was empty. The corn crib was empty. The horses were gone. The slaves had walked off with the Union column, which was its own message about how durable the Confederate social order actually was when 60,000 men with rifles decided to test it." What Burge and thousands of Georgia civilians experienced was not the slow erosion of a long siege, it was the sudden, total removal of everything that had made their daily lives function, accomplished in a single afternoon by men who were already 10 miles down the road by nightfall. That speed, men already 10 miles down the road by nightfall, was also the thing that most unhinged Confederate soldiers fighting in Virginia. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was dug into the Petersburg lines when word began filtering through that Sherman was moving through Georgia unopposed. The men in those trenches had wives and mothers and farms in the Georgia interior. They could not leave to protect them. They could not even get accurate information about where Sherman was and what he was doing, because Sherman had cut the telegraph lines ahead of his advance, and the Confederate communication network in Georgia was fragmenting under the pressure of the march. A soldier in Lee's army in late November might receive a letter postmarked Atlanta that was already 3 weeks old, describing a threat that by the time the letter arrived had already passed through or over everything the writer was worried about. The psychological torment of that helplessness, of being 2 states away, locked in a trench, while an army marched through your home county at 10 miles a day, is difficult to overstate. Desertion rates in the Army of Northern Virginia climbed during Sherman's march. The connection is not difficult to draw. Sherman reached the outskirts of Savannah on December 10th, 32 days after leaving Atlanta. He invested the city, cut its last supply lines, and sent a formal demand for surrender to Confederate General Hardee, noting, in a precision that was itself a form of psychological pressure, that he had plenty of artillery and was content to reduce the city at his leisure if Hardee chose to fight. Hardee chose not to. On the night of December 20th, the Confederate garrison evacuated across a pontoon bridge over the Savannah River into South Carolina, leaving the city to Sherman. On December 22nd, Sherman sent President Lincoln a telegram that has become one of the more famous dispatches of the war. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton. Lincoln, who had been watching Sherman's progress with growing anxiety since the telegraph network disappeared in mid-November, was almost visibly relieved. The army had not been destroyed. It had not starved. It had done something that the most cautious voices in Washington had argued was impossible, and it had done it in 32 days. What Sherman proved in those 32 days extended beyond the tactical and logistical. He proved something about the nature of Confederate power that the Confederate government had been trying to obscure for 3 years, that it was thinner and more brittle than it looked. The southern interior, stripped of its able-bodied men by the insatiable demands of Confederate armies in Virginia and Tennessee, had no real capacity to resist a sustained offensive thrust. The food and livestock and manufacturing capacity that Georgia contributed to the Confederate war effort was enormous and irreplaceable, but it was protected by nothing except distance and the assumption that no Union army would ever get that far. Sherman eliminated both of those protections simultaneously, and he did it at a speed that gave the Confederate government no time to adapt. He was not finished. In January of 1865, Sherman turned north out of Savannah and started into South Carolina, the state that had started the war, the symbolic beating heart of the Confederacy's original grievance. If he had moved fast through Georgia, he moved faster through South Carolina. The roads were worse, the swamps were deeper, and Confederate commanders who had watched the Georgia campaign expected Sherman to slow down in the rain and mud of a Carolina winter. He did not slow down. He crossed swamps his own engineers considered impassable. He kept his columns moving on days when the mud was so deep it swallowed wagon wheels to the axle. He covered South Carolina in approximately 40 days, reaching Goldsboro, North Carolina by late March, another roughly 400 miles of Confederate territory reduced to ash and twisted iron in the memory of what had been there before. By the time Sherman arrived in North Carolina, the arithmetic of the war had shifted irreversibly. Lee's army was bleeding out in the Petersburg trenches, cut off from the supplies that had moved through Georgia and South Carolina. The Confederate government in Richmond was discussing evacuation. The Confederate currency had already collapsed to the point where a loaf of bread in Richmond cost $30 in Confederate notes. The industrial capacity that Sherman had dismantled in his march, the corn and the livestock, the railroads and the repair shops, the cotton gins and the blacksmith forges, represented a loss from which the Confederacy simply had no time and no resources to recover, because Sherman had moved too fast to allow recovery. He had given them no siege to endure, no long, slow pressure that might have been adapted to and endured. He had given them velocity, and velocity was the one thing the Confederate defensive strategy had no answer for. Sherman himself was characteristically blunt about what he had done and why it worked. After the war, he wrote that the art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get to him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving. There is something almost irritatingly straightforward about that formulation when you read it alongside the elaborate strategic debates of the Civil War. But the simplicity was the point. Sherman had found the Confederate weakness, the vast, undefended, economically essential interior, and he had gotten there faster than anyone thought possible. And he had hit it harder than anyone thought survivable, and then he had kept moving. He had done it at 10 miles a day for 32 days, and then he had turned around and done it again for 40 more. The South did not forget it. Sherman's name became a kind of shorthand in the former Confederate states for a particular species of devastation, fast, total, impersonal, indifferent to the distance between military and civilian infrastructure. The bitterness lasted generations, which is itself a form of testimony to how completely and how rapidly the march had accomplished its purpose. You do not build a mythology of grievance around something that was slow and incomplete and easily recovered from. You build it around something that moved like a storm through everything you had and was gone before you fully understood what had happened, and left behind a landscape that would take decades to resemble what it had been before. That is what 60,000 men walking 10 miles a day for 32 days can do to a country. That is what speed looks like when it is aimed at the right target by the right man at the right moment in a war.